Hello, and welcome to Sleeper Historian. Imagine this: you're a woman in Victorian England, and congratulations, you're pregnant. Except, don't celebrate too soon. Because in this era, pregnancy wasn't a glowing miracle. It was closer to a high-stakes gamble with some very grim odds. Doctors didn't always know what they were doing. Midwives were working with superstition as much as science, and the advice you'd get could range from, drink a pint of stout, to, just hope for the best. And the truth is, many didn't survive. Before we dive in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Because unlike Victorian medicine, this channel actually improves your chances of survival. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and close your eyes as we step into the drawing rooms, hospitals, and cramped tenements of Victorian England, where pregnancy was less about baby showers and more about sheer survival. Congratulations! You've just entered the dangerous world of Victorian motherhood. It begins with the sound of carriage wheels over cobblestones, that clattering, uneven rhythm that makes you instinctively pull your cloak tighter around you. Though let's be honest, you probably don't own a cloak, but in Victorian London everyone seems to. The fog is hanging low, the lamps along the street glow in that familiar sepia haze, and somewhere close by a man is hawking roasted chestnuts, the smell drifting temptingly through the mist. You might want one, but then you remember where you are, and you notice the other smell that's harder to ignore. The Thames. She's never shy. 1 part river, 2 parts industrial dump, seasoned liberally with whatever the locals tossed out the back door that morning. Not exactly the kind of scent you'd bottle and call Eau de London. And yet, amid this city of soot, gaslight, and noise, there's another story winding quietly under the surface, and you're about to stumble right into it. Imagine for a moment that you're not here to tour the sights, or marvel at Big Ben in his newly built glory. No, you've been dropped in at a particularly delicate moment in a Victorian woman's life pregnancy. And trust me, if you're already thinking congratulations and pink baby bonnets, you might want to lower your expectations. In the 19th century, pregnancy was more of a terrifying gamble than a joyous occasion. If modern pregnancy comes with the stress of picking a stroller or finding out whether avocado toast is safe, the Victorian version came with a much simpler worry. Would you even survive the process? Now let's walk. You pass rows of terraced houses, some polished with iron railings and polished brass knockers, others leaning in a bit too close to their neighbors, crowded and worn down. In one of these houses, upstairs behind thin curtains, a woman clutches her belly. She's probably young, because most women who lived long enough to marry started having children early. And she's scared, not because she hasn't done this before. Odds are she's already buried a child or two, but because she knows she might join them this time. It's the sort of thought that creeps in at night, when the pains start earlier than expected, or when the midwife hasn't shown up yet, stuck down the road tending to another labor. You can almost hear the muffled moans from inside, the hurried whispers of sisters, mothers, or neighbors. And here's the part you might not expect: men are not in the room. Fathers, husbands. They wait elsewhere, pacing like nervous shadows, because childbirth is women's business, which sounds empowering until you realize woman's business here means blood, screaming, and sometimes a tragic silence that follows. It's around now you might be thinking, surely they had doctors. Well, sort of. By the mid-1800s, doctors were beginning to edge their way into childbirth, but let's just say the results were mixed. Many women still relied on midwives, who varied wildly in skill. Some were wise veterans carrying generations of knowledge. Others had a reputation for being about as helpful as a drunk uncle at a wedding. And doctors, though trained, often did something midwives did not: bring infections straight into the bedroom on the tips of their unwashed fingers. Yes, you heard that right. Victorian medicine had not yet discovered germs in the early decades, which means your well-dressed physician might sweep in smelling of pipe tobacco and starch, and proceed to handle you right after performing an autopsy downstairs. It's enough to make you want to roll the dice with the neighbor lady instead. At least she washed her hands occasionally. And let's pause for a second, because here's the irony you'll appreciate. Today we worry if the doctor forgets to sanitize the ultrasound probe, But in the 19th century, women literally died because their physician considered soap an optional accessory. Imagine a Yelp review from that time. Dr. Smith delivered my baby. 3 stars. Baby didn't make it, and neither did I. He was polite though. Back to the woman upstairs. You can picture her room. The heavy curtains are drawn to keep out the London chill, the air already stifling with the heat of the coal fire. Sheets hang at the ready, clean if the family is wealthy, patched and stained if not. Bowls of water sit nearby, though rarely used for the one thing that would have mattered most, sterilization. The midwife or doctor waits for the contractions to build. No epidurals, no numbing agents. If you're lucky, maybe a swig of gin or laudanum, which is essentially opium dissolved in alcohol, a kind of Victorian cocktail that works best if you don't mind being both high and unconscious at the same time. Picture it. Your pain relief comes in a dark glass bottle with a skull and crossbones worthy punch. One sip, and you're somewhere between dozing and hallucinating. In modern terms, it's like someone telling you to relax during labor and handing you a margarita mixed with morphine. Not exactly in the prenatal yoga handbook. And here's the cruel joke of it. Some women did find the edge taken off by these remedies, but laudanum was addictive, and its use often lingered far past childbirth. Babies born to mothers who used it heavily sometimes entered the world already dependent. It's one of those haunting details, like a cruel reminder that the solutions often made the problems worse. Now imagine you're the pregnant woman's neighbor. You're downstairs waiting with the husband, listening to the noises above. Each cry makes him flinch. Each silence makes him panic. He wants to rush in, but tradition and taboo hold him back. Instead, he lights another pipe, the smoke curling around his head like a restless spirit. He looks older than he is, because in Victorian London, everyone looks older than they are. Hard lives and grim realities age you quickly. When the baby finally comes, there are 2 possibilities. If things go well, there's a wail, a rush of relief, women bustling to clean, swaddle, and present the child. If not, silence. And it is the silence that terrified Victorians, the silence that too often followed the struggle. For a city drowning in progress, in railways and factories and gas lamps, childbirth remained stubbornly medieval in its risks. A woman could walk into labor in the morning and be carried out in a coffin by nightfall. And here's where you start to understand why Victorian women spoke about pregnancy in whispers. It wasn't a joyous secret to be revealed at a gender reveal party. No balloons, no confetti cannons, though frankly, with the amount of soot in London, they probably wouldn't have noticed confetti anyway. Instead, there was a hushed, careful acknowledgement. Pregnancy was less about celebrating new life and more about holding your breath, praying you'd make it through. If that seems grim, just wait. Because we've only scratched the surface. You've seen the fear, the danger, the whispered prayers. But next you'll step into the strange world of Victorian remedies for pregnancy, where superstition and medicine danced a dangerous waltz. And if you thought the laudanum bottle was bad, wait until you see what else they prescribed. You climb the narrow staircase, the wood creaking under your weight. Up here, away from the street, the air is thick, heavy with heat and something more metallic. The sharp tang of blood carried on damp fabric. The midwife wipes her brow with the back of her sleeve, muttering that this one is taking her time. She says it the way you might complain about a late train, but the truth is, taking her time is a phrase that can stretch from hours to days. Childbirth in the Victorian home was not a neat, 12-hour affair. It was an ordeal, unpredictable, and each hour that dragged on made the risk climb higher. If you dared to step closer, you'd notice the odd array of items on the small wooden table beside her. A pair of scissors, not unlike the ones used in the kitchen downstairs, a roll of linen cloth, a battered copy of some medical handbook that she probably never really reads, and, because it is the 19th century, an assortment of charms. Yes, charms. A sprig of rosemary, a scrap of ribbon tied in a knot, a little leather pouch with something mysterious inside. Science may have been crawling forward in laboratories across Europe, but here, inside this bedroom, old superstition kept its claws firmly dug in. And the advice! The advice that Victorian women received would make even the worst internet forums look reliable. Don't frighten a pregnant woman, people said, or she might pass her fear into the baby. Don't let her gaze at monkeys in the zoo, or her child might be born with an unfortunate resemblance. If she craved strawberries and didn't get them, the baby might arrive with a red birthmark. Forget folic acid and prenatal vitamins. The Victorians believed in keeping a woman's mind calm, her appetite moderate, and her soul pure, which sounds nice until you realize that moderate often meant underfed, and pure was a polite way of telling her not to complain. Now, every so often, if the woman was wealthy, a doctor might be summoned to replace or assist the midwife. He would arrive in a crisp coat, his hair carefully combed, his bag of instruments rattling with ominous weight. Forceps, perhaps, the great invention of earlier centuries that had become something of a medical obsession. The Victorians adored their instruments, though women often did not. Imagine being in the most vulnerable moment of your life and having a man stride in with something that looks suspiciously like a pair of blacksmith's tongs. Yes, the forceps could save lives, but in the wrong hands, they caused tearing, trauma, even death. You know how today, some people panic if the doctor suggests a C-section. In the Victorian era, the mere appearance of forceps made hearts race with dread. It was a gamble, salvation or disaster, and because anesthesia was in its infancy, if you were conscious during their use, you felt every bit of it. On the bright side, if you were unconscious, it was probably because someone had given you a chloroform-soaked rag and told you to breathe deep. Effective. Sometimes. Safe. Not always. A little like trusting your uncle to fix your car because he once read a manual. And let's be honest, chloroform wasn't always administered out of compassion. In fact, some doctors resisted giving pain relief at all. They quoted scripture, claiming women were meant to suffer in childbirth because of Eve's ancient apple mishap. Imagine being in excruciating pain, screaming for mercy, and your doctor shrugs and says, "Sorry, blame Genesis." It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, old-fashioned values. Meanwhile, in poorer households, forget chloroform. You might get nothing more than a damp rag to bite on. Maybe a glass of gin if the family could afford it. The cries that echoed from these cramped, overcrowded rooms became part of the neighborhood soundtrack, much like the sound of street vendors or the clatter of horse hooves. Everyone knew what those cries meant, and everyone also knew they might not end with a baby's first breath. Now, imagine if Instagram existed back then. A Victorian influencer might post, "Finally pregnant again! Prayers appreciated. Hoping I survive this one. Fun blessed fi laudanum life for please send strawberries." And instead of comments full of pink hearts, she'd get neighbors showing up with a candle and muttering, "Well, best of luck, dear." And here's another cruel twist. Not only was childbirth itself dangerous, but even after delivery, women faced the invisible threat of puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever. It's one of those phrases that sounds gentle until you realize it was a bacterial infection, so swift and deadly it could take a mother within days. Doctors carried it from patient to patient, their hands like Trojan horses of infection. Imagine a man delivering 3 babies in a single afternoon, proudly shaking hands with each father in between, blissfully unaware that he was the true executioner in the story. Some doctors even prided themselves on not needing to wash. One wrote that the idea was absurd, that gentlemen's hands could not possibly carry disease. Which is fascinating when you consider those same hands had likely been dissecting corpses earlier in the day. If you've ever been grossed out by someone not washing their hands after leaving a public restroom, just picture this guy, straight from autopsy to nursery, barely wiping his fingers on a handkerchief. Suddenly that little bottle of hand sanitizer in your pocket feels like divine intervention, doesn't it? And so, mothers lived in fear. A successful birth was not the end of the nightmare, but the start of another countdown. The fever could appear suddenly, chills, weakness, pain, and there was no cure. Women wasted away, leaving behind grieving husbands and orphaned infants. It became so common that some families prepared for it as they would for a funeral, setting aside black dresses just in case. And yet life went on. Babies were born. Funerals were held, and another pregnancy often followed quickly. Because here's the other thing about Victorian marriage: children weren't just blessings, they were expectations. A woman might bear 10, 12, even 15 times in her life, her body never given the luxury of recovery. Each pregnancy was another spin of the wheel, another chance to face that silence at the end of labor. You can almost see her, our woman in the upstairs room, her hair matted with sweat, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She whispers prayers under her breath, half to God, half to herself. And you, standing there as a silent time traveler, know something she doesn't. That across the city, countless women whisper the same words tonight, hoping against hope that they'll still be breathing tomorrow. And if you think that's harrowing, just wait. Because the deeper you step into this world, the stranger it becomes. Remedies grow bizarre, advice grows darker, and the line between medicine and superstition blurs so completely you won't know which is which. Next, you'll see what Victorians prescribe to help mothers recover after birth, and trust me, you'll never look at castor oil or mustard plasters the same way again. The cries have faded now, the room quieter than it should be. The baby rests against the mother's chest, pink, fragile, wrapped in swaddling cloth that's more patchwork than perfection. But the real danger hasn't passed. It's only shifted shape. The midwife is already rattling about in her bag, pulling out jars, powders, and little parcels of things that look like they belong in a spice cupboard rather than a sick room. Recovery, in the Victorian sense, was a performance as much as a process, and women were expected to play their part, whether they were strong enough to or not. Take confinement, for example. After birth, women were often kept indoors for weeks, sometimes months, their windows shuttered, their bedsheets heavy. The idea was that rest would allow the body to heal, but confinement also created an airless, germ-filled chamber where fevers thrived. Visitors came and went, pressing kisses to the baby's forehead, crowding the room with chatter, and all the while the mother lay pale and trembling, too weak to protest. A strange kind of social theatre played out in those weeks. Neighbors bringing broth, aunts arriving with advice, gossip circling the bed like a second kind of infection. And what advice it was. Mothers were told not to cry, lest their milk sour. They were told not to eat certain foods, spices, pickles, anything stimulating, lest it corrupt the child's blood. One guide even suggested women should avoid excitement of any kind, because strong emotions might poison breast milk. Imagine explaining that to a modern mother. Sorry dear, you'll need to avoid Netflix dramas for a few months. All that suspense might give your baby indigestion. Then there were the tonics. Victorians adored tonics. Bottles of bitter syrups and elixirs lined every chemist's shelf, all boasting miraculous powers. Ironically, most contained the same handful of ingredients: alcohol, opium, and a sprinkle of herbs to make the mixture smell medicinal. Mothers were urged to sip these brews to regain their strength. One particularly popular concoction combined brandy with powdered bark, sold under the promise of fortifying the female constitution. In reality, it left women tipsy and, if taken often enough, dependent. But hey, at least you forgot you were in agony. Picture the scene. A pale young mother propped against pillows, her hand trembling as she lifts a glass of dark liquid to her lips. Her relatives murmur approvingly. She is recovering well. No one mentions that she's now more sedated than restored. It's a quiet deception, one that countless women lived through, because to admit weakness was to fail in your role as a wife and mother. And in a society obsessed with appearances, failure was not an option. And here's where we stumble across one of the strangest Victorian obsessions: mustard plasters. Yes, mustard. The same stuff you squeeze onto a hot dog today was, in the 19th century, pressed into cloth and slapped onto the skin as a revitalizing treatment. Applied to the chest or abdomen, the heat and sting of the mustard were supposed to draw illness out of the body. In practice, they left women with burns, welts, and a smell that lingered longer than dignity. Imagine being told, after surviving childbirth, that the secret to recovery is smelling like a ham sandwich. Of course, if mustard didn't appeal, there was always castor oil. Swallowed in thick spoonfuls, it was said to purify the bowels, because Victorians were absolutely convinced that almost every health problem started with digestion. Got a fever, purge the stomach. Feeling weak, purge again. Just gave birth, better purge twice. It's hard to say what was worse: the physical pain of childbirth, or the indignity of having your aunt stand over you, insisting another spoonful of oil would do the trick. And yet, for all the silliness, there was something heartbreaking in the persistence of it. Families clung to these rituals not because they were cruel, but because they were desperate. They wanted their wives, daughters, sisters to survive, and when real medicine failed them, or worse, killed them, they turned to whatever scraps of tradition or folklore they had left. Better to rub mustard on a chest than to do nothing at all. Now, let's step back outside for a breath of air. The house looms behind you, its windows glowing faintly in the fog. Down the street, another cry rings out from another window, another mother beginning her battle upstairs. You realize just how constant this was, how common. At any given time in London, hundreds of women were laboring, dozens were dying, and all of it hidden neatly behind closed doors. The streets bustled with carriages and chatter, but inside, childbirth was the private theatre of suffering that every family knew too well. And while women endured upstairs, men gathered in taverns or parlours, drinking and smoking, toasting the hopeful arrival of a new son. They joked, they bragged, they waited, and sometimes they mourned. But rarely did they see the process itself. The divide between men and women during childbirth was almost sacred. It preserved mystery, but it also preserved ignorance. How could a husband advocate for his wife's safety when he was never allowed to witness the dangers firsthand? If you're thinking, surely someone must have noticed how dangerous all this was, you're right. Reformers, especially women, began to campaign for better maternal care. Pamphlets were written, midwives trained more formally, and hospitals, grim, terrifying hospitals, began to open maternity wards. But here's the catch. Those wards often had even higher death rates than home births, thanks to that stubborn ignorance of germs. A hospital bed, with its stiff sheets and whitewashed walls, might look cleaner than a cramped bedroom. But if every doctor walking through had just come from dissecting a cadaver, it was little more than a trap disguised as progress. It's one of those delicious ironies history loves to hand us. The very institutions built to save women often became their coffins. Meanwhile, poorer women who couldn't afford hospitals sometimes had better odds at home, attended by a careful midwife with fewer, modern, tools. It's as if the world conspired to make survival feel like a lottery ticket. One where the numbers were stacked against you from the start. And imagine the gossip. Birth stories whispered over laundry lines, muttered in church pews, passed along at market stalls. Every woman carried the memory of her own labor and the knowledge of others. It created a kind of unspoken sisterhood, one built not on empowerment posters and hashtags, but on shared fear and endurance. Today, women might swap birth stories over coffee, laughing about epidurals or awkward doctors. In Victorian London, those stories were survival manuals, warnings, instructions, grim reminders. And so life continued in its strange Victorian rhythm. Gas lamps flickering, factories roaring, children crying, mothers recovering or not recovering, and always the shadow of the next pregnancy waiting just around the corner. Because make no mistake, survival was temporary. The moment a woman's body began to heal, society expected it to begin again, and again, and again. Each cycle chipped away at her, until eventually she broke. If that doesn't leave you uneasy, it should. Because what came next was even stranger. Beyond the plasters and tonics and whispered prayers, the Victorians began experimenting with something far more dangerous: surgical interventions. And if you thought forceps were terrifying, wait until you see what happened when scalpels entered the room. Back upstairs, the air feels heavier. The baby sleeps now, curled like a small question mark against its mother's chest. The midwife fusses, tidying cloths, muttering about how she's seen worse, and how this one is lucky. Lucky is a strange word when you've nearly bled out on a mattress, and the floorboards beneath you are still damp, but in the Victorian sense. Yes, she's alive, which is more than can be said for countless others. But not every story ended this way. By the later decades of the 19th century, medicine had advanced far enough that doctors were eager to try new techniques, many of them surgical. Surgery and childbirth, however, are words that should never be put together casually, especially in an age when anesthesia was primitive and antisepsis barely existed. The most terrifying of these was the caesarean section. Now, you probably hear C-section and think of a sterile operating room, bright lights, the beep of machines. In Victorian London, A C-section was closer to a gamble with death himself, and he usually won. Surgeons performed the operation rarely and reluctantly, because survival rates for mothers were almost non-existent. Without antibiotics, infection set in quickly. Without proper blood transfusions, bleeding could not be controlled. If you underwent a caesarean in the 1800s, it was often because you were already dying, and the family begged for a chance, any chance, that the child might live. Imagine the scene. A woman writhing in agony. The doctor grimly setting his instruments on the table. The husband pacing outside, already grieving. The house silent except for muffled cries, until at last they stop. The baby sometimes survived, sometimes not. The mother, almost never. And yet doctors kept records, published papers, debated methods, all in the name of progress. To them, each tragedy was a step toward knowledge, each body a grim teacher. To the families, though, it was simply loss. And if you think that sounds grim, consider this anesthesia, when it was used, carried its own dangers. Chloroform. Hailed as a miracle when Queen Victoria famously used it for the birth of her 8th child, could slow breathing to the point of death. Either, another favorite, left patients vomiting and gasping. Administered clumsily, it suffocated rather than soothed. So the Victorian woman in surgery faced a double-edged sword awake. She suffered beyond imagination asleep. She might never wake again. It's strange to stand here, in this upstairs bedroom, and realize how normalized all of this was. Families whispered prayers not for an easy birth, but for survival, which tells you everything about their expectations. The black dress hung at the back of the wardrobe wasn't only for funerals already past, it was kept ready, just in case. Coffin makers knew to carve smaller boxes in bulk. Cemeteries expanded like hungry beasts at the edges of the city, filling with row upon row of mothers who never got to hold their children for more than a moment. And yet, amid the tragedy, life pressed on. Neighbors brought flowers, casseroles, or the Victorian equivalent. Bread broth, sometimes a little pudding. Women visited to console the widower, reminding him gently that he would remarry, that children needed a mother, that life must go on. Grief had a timetable in this world, and the living couldn't afford to linger too long in mourning. The strangest part. Many of these tragedies happened in the wealthiest homes. Money bought doctors, doctors brought instruments, instruments brought infection. Poorer women, left with nothing but midwives and superstition, sometimes survived, more often by sheer accident. It's one of history's cruel ironies. Poverty spared some by keeping them away from the latest advances. You can almost see the divide. In Mayfair, a physician in a starched collar carefully sets down his bloodied forceps, believing he has advanced science. In Whitechapel, a barefoot midwife wipes her hands on her apron and sighs in relief as the mother breathes, both of them blissfully unaware of the germs they've avoided. The city lived in two worlds at once, progress and peril, wealth and want, science and superstition, all colliding in the single moment of childbirth. And through it all, women endured. They whispered, they prayed, they told each other the truth in hushed tones while smiling politely at men who insisted everything was fine. They drank the tonics, swallowed the oils, endured the mustard plasters. They gave birth in rooms too dark, too damp, too crowded. They walked through pregnancies not with joy, but with dread, bracing themselves for what might come. If you pause here, you can almost feel it. The weight of the silence that follows a birth gone wrong. The wail that never comes. The whisper of black skirts brushing the floorboards as neighbors arrive to comfort. The echo of the baby's cry in a room that's already growing cold. It is the sound of a world that demanded women sacrifice everything to produce life, and then punished them for failing. And yet, not all stories were tragic. Some mothers survived, some children thrived, and families grew in spite of the risks. Queen Victoria herself had 9 children, and lived to complain about them well into her later years. But for every queen, there were thousands of nameless women buried in unmarked graves, their stories forgotten, their struggles reduced to statistics in medical journals. Now, here's where we'll leave this first night in Victorian London. You've seen the fog, smelled the blood and coal smoke, walked the creaking stairs, and stood in the room where survival was never guaranteed. You've seen the midwives, the doctors, the instruments, the bottles of laudanum, the mustard plasters, the whispered prayers. You've seen life and death balanced so precariously that one wrong breath, one careless hand, could tip it either way. But if you think this was the darkest corner of the story, you'd be wrong. Because childbirth was only the beginning. What came after was just as strange, sometimes cruel, sometimes absurd. From confinement rituals that bordered on imprisonment to the bizarre advice women received about breastfeeding and child rearing, the world of the Victorian mother was an endless gauntlet. And if you think surviving labor was an achievement, wait until you see what they faced when trying to keep their babies, and themselves, alive afterward. You wake to silence. The street outside still hums faintly with cart wheels, hawkers, the distant clatter of a horse's shoes striking cobblestones. But inside this narrow London house the sound is muffled. Curtains are drawn, lamps dimmed. It's as if the world itself has been instructed to tiptoe. This, you're told, is confinement. Confinement meant exactly what it sounds like: the mother shut away, wrapped in sheets, fed weak broth, and told to stay absolutely still for weeks, sometimes even months, depending on her doctor's whims or her mother-in-law's convictions. The idea was that her body had been shattered by childbirth, and the only way to recover was to retreat from life itself. She must not lift anything heavier than a spoon. She must not walk beyond the edge of her bed. She must not laugh too hard, or cry too long, or even read novels, because emotional strain might disturb her fragile constitution. Now imagine that, 6 to 8 weeks in a dark room, windows shuttered, while life outside rolls on. Friends whisper at the door, bringing gossip and muffins. Children run wild downstairs. The husband, if attentive, sits awkwardly at the edge of the bed for 5 minutes, then escapes to the club. And the mother, pale and restless, lies there listening to the clock tick, wondering if she'll ever feel like herself again. The Victorians took this so seriously that entire manuals were written about how to behave during confinement. Keep her quiet, they insisted. Let no excitement disturb her. Excitement in this context could mean anything from a loud noise to the scent of fried fish drifting upstairs. A particularly strict physician might even forbid conversation. Imagine surviving childbirth, only to be punished with a solitary retreat that made prison look lively. Of course, some women didn't mind. In a household buzzing with children, servants, and constant activity, the idea of being left alone in bed with trays of tea and biscuits might have sounded heavenly. But not everyone was so fortunate. For poorer women, there was no luxury of confinement. Laundry didn't fold itself, bread didn't bake itself, and babies, plural, didn't feed themselves. Many women were back at the washtub or market within days, still bleeding, still weak, because life simply didn't pause for recovery. The rich woman lay in silks, the poor woman sweated in rags, and between them stretched the entire cruel spectrum of Victorian society. And then there were the visitors. Confinement might sound like solitude, but the moment doctors deemed the mother stable enough, neighbors and relatives appeared, crowding into her dim little room with gifts, gossip, and unsolicited advice. They cooed over the baby, sniffed the linens, scolded the servants, and reminded the mother she looked pale, as if she hadn't noticed. Some brought superstitions as gifts: tie a red ribbon to ward off evil, sprinkle salt under the cradle, keep cats away lest they steal the baby's breath. The room became less sanctuary, more stage, with the exhausted mother forced to play hostess to an endless parade of self-appointed experts. And here's the cruelest irony: confinement was meant to protect, but it often made things worse. Shut away in dark, unventilated rooms, women developed infections from lingering birth injuries. Bed sores spread, spirits collapsed. Postpartum depression, which they didn't have a name for, was written off as hysteria or weakness, instead of fresh air and gentle walks. Women were dosed with laudanum to keep them calm, further fogging their minds. If you wanted to design a system guaranteed to trap a woman in misery, confinement would be your masterpiece. One can almost hear the grumbling sarcasm of a Victorian husband. She's only been in bed 6 weeks. Surely she can get up now and pour my tea. And just like that, many women were dragged back into duty before they were ready. Think of the modern cliché of moms bouncing back after birth and multiply it by 10. Because the Victorian wife didn't just have to look healthy. She had to run a household, host dinner parties, and sometimes get pregnant again before she'd even finished recovering. If you lean against the wall here and listen, you'll catch a softer sound, the baby. Tenny, insistent, almost metallic in its wailing. Feeding time. Now comes another battlefield of the Victorian maternal experience, breastfeeding. Some women breastfed, but not all. For the wealthy, it was often considered unseemly, even animalistic. Why should a lady lower herself to the task when a wet nurse could do it? So newborns were sometimes passed almost immediately into another woman's arms, one already lactating from her own recent birth, paid to provide milk. On paper, it seems practical. In reality, it was risky. Wet nurses sometimes cared for multiple infants at once, their attention divided, their hygiene questionable. Disease spread easily. Babies wasted away, sometimes because the wet nurse had little milk, sometimes because she diluted it with cow's milk or bread, soaked water to make it stretch further. Those who couldn't afford wet nurses turned to substitutes. Enter the era of pap and panada, charmingly named but terrifying concoctions of breadcrumbs, water, sugar, sometimes beer. Yes, beer. Because nothing says infant nutrition like a pint of weak ale in the cradle. Unsurprisingly, mortality rates skyrocketed. Malnourished babies developed rickets, convulsions, or simply wasted away in silence. By mid-century, infant mortality in London was so high that families spoke of babies in probabilities, not certainties. Why have 6 children? They'd say, though only 3 are living. The tragedy was not always visible from outside. Walk down the street and you'd see neat prams, tidy nurseries, cheerful portraits of plump toddlers in lace. Behind closed doors, though, many mothers rocked empty cradles, mourning silently. Society expected them to keep trying, to fill the house with hairs, to provide their husbands with legacy. Grief was private, but pressure was very public. And if you think this cycle of confinement, exhaustion, and loss was unbearable, wait until you see how society judged those same women for every misstep they made. The Victorian mother was simultaneously expected to be an angel of the house, endlessly nurturing and pure, and a sturdy machine, endlessly productive and uncomplaining. A contradiction so sharp you could cut your finger on it. If you thought the quiet terror of childbirth was brutal, just wait until you see what happens when Victorian mothers try to raise those fragile little lives. Because next comes the nursery, the place where superstition, science, and sheer desperation collided in the raising of children who, statistically speaking, might not make it past their 5th birthday. Step quietly into the nursery, and you'll feel the temperature drop. Not from the chill of London fog seeping through cracked windows, but from the atmosphere of sheer anxiety. This is where theory meets practice, where all the advice from doctors, midwives, and gossiping neighbors collides with the raw cries of an infant. The nursery itself was often a curious mix of comfort and danger. A rocking cradle carved from oak might sit near the fireplace, lined with lace and padded with feathers. Pretty, yes, but highly flammable. Curtains flutter dangerously close to the flames. Toys, if present, are carved from wood or stitched from fabric. No plastic safety checks here, just the faint taste of lead paint if a child happens to gnaw too long. And gnaw they did, because teething was one of those mysterious stages that Victorians regarded with near supernatural dread. Teething, according to popular belief, could cause fevers, convulsions, insanity, or even death. The solution: lancing the gums with sharp instruments to release the pressure. Imagine a doctor, mustache bristling with authority, leaning over a squirming infant with a scalpel. The result was usually blood infection, and sometimes fatal consequences. But hey, at least they tried. Others rubbed opium syrup on the gums to soothe the baby. That syrup had such a pleasant name too. Godfrey's cordial. It sounds like something you'd sip politely at a tea party, not a narcotic strong enough to knock out a grown man. But babies were dosed with it regularly, their cries silenced by chemical sleep. Parents would beam proudly at their peacefully resting child. Never mind the fact that the peace came from a drug stronger than anything you'd be prescribed for surgery today. And if the baby made it past teething, more perils awaited. Croup, measles, scarlet fever, all could sweep through a nursery in days, taking down the frailest without mercy. Doctors would prescribe blistering agents to draw out illness, which meant literally burning the child's skin with chemicals in the hope that the disease would follow the path of pain. If that failed, they'd suggest cold baths, or mustard poultices smeared across tiny chests, leaving behind yellow stains and cries of protest. The nursery was supposed to be a sanctuary, yet it often felt like a laboratory for bad ideas. Here's the absurd part: while babies were being drugged, cut, and blistered in the name of medicine, Victorians were also wildly sentimental about childhood. Portraits of cherubic infants hung in parlours. Poems about innocence filled magazines. Mothers were lectured constantly about their sacred duty to protect their children, yet given tools that guaranteed suffering. It's like telling someone to drive safely, and then handing them a carriage with no wheels. And hovering always above the crib was religion. Baptisms were rushed within days of birth, not only as a holy ritual but as insurance. Because infant death was so common that parents feared their child might slip into eternity unblessed. Some families kept christening gowns always at the ready, so that when the midwife whispered, "Not long," the priest could be summoned immediately, splashing holy water on a baby who might not survive the hour. For those who did, the gown became a treasured heirloom, worn again by younger siblings, patched and resewn until the lace frayed to threads. Listen closely, though, to the whispers between mothers. They speak of charms and amulets, of herbs tucked beneath pillows, of placing scissors in the cradle to ward off witches. One might tie coral beads around her baby's neck, believed to protect against evil and aid teething, though the beads themselves were a choking hazard. Another swears by hanging sprigs of rue over the door. Science and superstition coexisted easily, because when survival rates are so low, you'll try anything. And when your baby sleeps through the night, after you've tied a red string to their wrist, you'll believe it worked, even if it was simply exhaustion. Modern parents may complain about baby monitors that don't sync to Wi-Fi or diaper brands that leak. But imagine if your nursery checklist included opium syrup, gum lancet, and witch scarer. By comparison, today's sleepless nights and overpriced strollers feel almost luxurious. What strikes you most, standing here in the flickering lamplight, is the silence of fear. Every cough, every fever, every restless night could signal the end. A mother might watch her child breathe, counting each fragile exhalation, terrified that one would be the last. And when death came, and it often did, the mourning was both personal and public. Tiny coffins were paraded through streets. Mourning clothes were stitched in miniature. Families posed for photographs with their deceased infants. A practice that seems macabre now but was a desperate attempt to preserve memory when life was so fleeting. The nursery was both cradle and coffin, hope and heartbreak. Every lullaby hummed softly carried an undertone of dread, every christening a hedge against loss. Victorians loved their children fiercely, but they loved them with the knowledge that they might not keep them. And if you think the weight of motherhood ended with cradles and funerals, you'd be mistaken. Because while women were expected to suffer silently through childbirth and confinement, and to pour themselves endlessly into nurseries full of risk, society was already watching, already judging, already shaping her role into something more insidious. The angel of the house. A woman whose worth was defined entirely by how perfectly she performed her sacrifices. Step back from the nursery for a moment, out into the corridor where the air feels less stifling. You can hear the muffled hum of life elsewhere, in the housey servants clattering in the kitchen. A piano note struck unevenly in the parlor, the faint cough of a child somewhere in the distance. Yet here, the echoes of confinement and the cries of infants linger, as though the walls themselves have soaked up centuries of exhaustion. For the Victorian mother, survival was rarely her own. Her body was a vessel, her recovery an afterthought, her grief a private luxury. She could lose 3 babies in 5 years, and still be expected to smile at dinner, to pour her husband's wine, to greet guests without letting the tremor in her voice betray her heart. Sorrow was acknowledged, yes, but it was also dressed up in etiquette, corseted into silence. To mourn too loudly was vulgar, to retreat too long was selfish, and to complain at all was simply not an option. This was the cruelty hidden in lace women, told they were sacred, angelic, the moral compass of the household, and yet treated as though their only true worth was the number of children who survived their womb. They bore the pain in silence, dosed themselves with laudanum, pressed handkerchiefs to their eyes, and turned again toward duty. To be a Victorian mother was to live in a world where your own suffering was invisible, your failures exaggerated, and your endurance taken for granted. And still, through it all, there were moments of real tenderness. A lullaby whispered into the dark, a tiny hand gripping a finger. The smell of milk and soap clinging to blankets. These fragile bonds were what gave women the strength to keep trying, even when the odds were stacked against them. The quiet resilience of motherhood, rarely praised, rarely recorded, was what kept entire households standing. But if you think the nursery was the cruelest stage, you've only seen half the performance. Because beyond the walls of the home, society itself was watching, weaving a web of rules, expectations, and judgments that would suffocate women in subtler, yet equally devastating ways. If you thought confinement and the nursery were cruel, wait until you see how Victorian society turned motherhood into a moral battlefield, where even a woman's silence, or the shape of her smile, could decide her worth. You step outside into the grey breath of a London morning, and immediately you feel it eyes. They're everywhere. The milkman, the neighbour adjusting her bonnet, even the ragged newsboy yelling about another scandal, they all glance your way. Not because you are extraordinary, but because you are a woman, and in this world. That alone makes you a canvas for judgment. Victorian society was obsessed with appearances, and nowhere was this obsession more vicious than in the case of mothers. A woman could labour alone in blood and agony, could nearly die in her confinement, could bury a child in silence, and still, what people wanted to see was not her suffering, but her performance. Was she smiling enough? Did she keep her house tidy? Did she edge from her lying in, pale and delicate, but not too pale? Did she step back into her social role without complaint, proving herself the perfect angel of the house? That phrase, angel of the house, floated constantly through magazines, sermons, and lectures. It was less a compliment, more a chain. An angel was pure, selfless, devoted, and above all invisible. She had no wants of her own, no anger, no resentment, no desire beyond serving her family. She bore children without protest, raised them without fatigue, and suffered without ever drawing attention to the suffering. To be less than this was failure. To be more than this was scandal. And scandals were delicious. Neighbours whispered about the mother who left her infant with a nurse for too many hours. About the woman who was seen laughing at a ball mere weeks after childbirth. About the widow who wore her mourning dress for a suspiciously short time before smiling at another man. Every detail was a story, every story a judgment, and every judgment a reminder that motherhood was not private, but public theatre. Even science got in on the act. Physicians, usually male, often pompous, lectured women about their moral duty to breastfeed, to remain calm, to avoid hysterical emotions that might poison their milk. Imagine being told that your bad mood could literally sour your child's food supply. Talk about emotional blackmail. And if your child fell sick or failed to thrive, whispers circled back to you. Perhaps you were careless, perhaps you hadn't prayed enough, perhaps your womb was flawed, your character weak. The cruelest part. Even when death was inevitable, blame rarely shifted. A baby could die from contaminated milk, from a disease sweeping the slums, from treatments prescribed by the very doctors themselves, and still the mother would feel the weight of accusation. She had not been vigilant enough, pure enough, angelic enough. In this suffocating atmosphere, many women turned their frustration inward. Diaries from the period sometimes reveal a quiet despair. Women who admitted they longed for rest, for space, for freedom, but immediately followed the confession with guilt. To want anything outside motherhood was selfish. To admit exhaustion was weakness. Better to swallow laudanum at night and wake with a smile in the morning, convincing yourself and everyone else that you were happy. The truth is, the angel of the house was not a real woman. She was a ghostly ideal invented by men, polished by sermons, enforced by gossip, and quietly accepted because no one dared challenge it. The women themselves became actresses in a play they did not audition for, holding their lines while their bodies broke behind the curtain. And if you think this silent performance was suffocating enough, just wait until you see what happens when politics, empire, and even science itself decide to climb into the nursery, declaring that the fate of the nation rests squarely in a mother's lap. Step further down the street, past the flower sellers and the choking smoke of a coal cart, and you'll notice something strange. Motherhood, once confined to parlors and nurseries, now spills into newspapers, parliamentary debates, and even scientific journals. Suddenly, a woman's private choices are no longer private at all. They are treated as matters of national survival. The Victorians were obsessed with strength, the strength of the empire, the strength of the race, the strength of the household that supposedly propped it all up. And who bore the burden of this strength? Mothers. Every child was a future worker, soldier, colonist, or missionary. Everyone was a battlefield on which the destiny of Britain was supposedly being fought. No pressure. Medical men lectured endlessly on the need for healthy women to produce healthy children. But their definitions of healthy usually boiled down to: don't think too much, don't read too much, don't walk too much, don't do anything except sit gracefully, embroider, and prepare to give birth. One physician even warned that too much education would shrivel a woman's womb. Imagine sitting in a lecture hall today and being told your uterus was offended by algebra. Meanwhile, politics weighed in with a moral stick. Poor women were chastised for having too many, children blamed for filling slums with hungry mouths. Rich women were chastised for having too few, accused of selfishness if they dared to stop at only 1 or 2 hairs. Damned if you did, damned if you didn't. The womb was no longer just a body part. It was a ledger for society's anxieties, a symbol wielded by politicians and moralists alike. The empire, too, leaned heavily on the maternal image. Paintings and pamphlets celebrated Britannia as a mother figure, cradling colonies in her arms, dispensing civilization like milk. Real mothers, of course, were less romantic. They were scrubbing linens, dosing babies with opium syrup, and silently grieving when half of them didn't survive to adulthood. Yet the symbolism persisted. To fail as a mother was to fail the nation. And as if the nation weren't enough, there was also God. Preachers thundered from pulpits that motherhood was a holy calling, that women who embraced their suffering were closer to sainthood. Pain was purification, death in childbirth a noble sacrifice, endless pregnancies a divine duty. So women smiled through clenched teeth, prayed through fevers, and tried to believe that their exhaustion was sacred rather than simply ignored. The contradiction was staggering. On the one hand, mothers were exalted as the moral backbone of society. On the other, they were denied education, medical autonomy, and even the right to complain about their conditions. They were lifted onto pedestals and simultaneously buried under expectations. A halo was pressed onto their heads while a yoke was tied around their necks. If you lean close, you'll hear the private whispers again. Women confessing to one another in hushed tones that they dreaded another pregnancy, that they feared dying like their sister or mother had, that sometimes they resented their own children. But these whispers rarely escaped the parlor walls. To speak them aloud in public would mean scandal, perhaps even ruin. So they swallowed their doubts with laudanum and carried on, pretending the angelic mask was real. And yet, in these contradictions, you see the cracks forming. Some women began to rebel quietly, to question the sermons, to slip pamphlets of early feminism into their sewing baskets, to wonder if perhaps motherhood should be a choice rather than a destiny. They were few, but their whispers would eventually swell into voices. For now, though, most remained trapped in lace and silence. You can almost feel the weight of it pressing down, the suffocating sense that no matter how well a mother performed, it was never enough. Too many children, too few, too loud, too quiet, too sick, too healthy, it didn't matter. She was always on trial. And if you thought being judged by neighbors and doctors was cruel, just wait until you see what happens when desperation drives women to seek out the one thing society refused them control over their own fertility. Because next comes the shadowy, dangerous world of Victorian contraception and abortion, where secrecy and scandal intertwined with survival. The street smells different at night. By day, London reeks of coal smoke, horse dung, and frying fish. But at night, when the fog rolls low and the lanterns burn dim, another scent rises: secrecy. A mix of stale gin, damp wool, and the sharp tang of fear. This is when the whispers come out, when women slip through alleyways in search of answers they cannot ask in daylight. Pregnancy was supposed to be sacred, inevitable, God's will. But for many women, it was terror. A wealthy wife might dread another confinement that would nearly kill her. A factory worker might already be struggling to feed 5 hungry mouths. A servant girl might carry the shame of her master's advances, her swollen belly threatening to ruin her completely. For all of them, the question was the same. How do you stop what society insists must never be stopped? The truth is, Victorian women had methods. Plenty of them, whispered from mother to daughter, scrawled in penny pamphlets, tucked slyly into the back pages of medical manuals. Some were simple sponges soaked in vinegar, douches of carbolic acid, herbs boiled into teas so bitter they made your stomach twist. Others were elaborate contraptions of gut, rubber, and ivory, early condoms, cervical caps, pessaries, sold discreetly in apothecaries under the counter. But buying them carried risks. A woman seen purchasing such things might be branded immoral, a prostitute, or worse, unnatural. And then there were the more dangerous methods. Quack doctors advertised female pills that promised to regulate the cycle. Everyone knew what regulate meant. Some were laced with pennyroyal or savin, herbs known to induce miscarriage, but also to cause kidney failure or death if taken in the wrong dose. Women took them anyway, clutching their stomachs in dark rooms, praying the cramping would bring relief rather than a funeral. For those who could afford it, there were backstreet procedures, a midwife with sharp instruments, a surgeon with looser ethics, a whispered appointment after dark. Some women survived, many didn't. Infections, hemorrhage, and shame stalked every attempt. But when the alternative was another dangerous pregnancy, some chose the risk. The statistics were quietly staggering. Officially, abortion was illegal. Unofficially, it was common enough that newspapers railed against baby killers, with the kind of fervor that suggests everyone already knew someone who'd tried it. The cruelty lay not only in the danger, but in the silence. Society wagged its finger at fallen women, even as countless respectable wives did the very same in secret. Doctors condemned abortion in journals, while quietly performing procedures for wealthy patients behind closed doors. And women bore the brunt of the hypocrisy. Blamed for desperation, punished for survival. Imagine the fear walking into a stranger's parlor, clutching a few coins, trying not to tremble as you asked for help with your monthly problem. The woman across the table, maybe a midwife, maybe a fraud, nodding briskly, offering a brew that smelled like bitter herbs and death. You swallow it anyway, because what choice do you have? And if you think this was only the realm of the poor, think again. Aristocratic ladies, too, sought ways to space pregnancies, though they had the privilege of better doctors and quieter gossip. Some simply sent their delicate wives to the continent for long health cures that suspiciously ended in miscarriage. Others relied on imported contraceptives, smuggled in discreet packages. Respectability shielded them from the scandal, but not from the danger. Meanwhile, pamphleteers like Charles Knowlton and Annie Besant dared to publish information on birth control, sparking outrage. Besant herself stood trial in 1877 for obscenity, after distributing a manual that explained contraception in plain language. Imagine that. Knowledge itself was considered obscene. A man could buy pornography at a street stall, but a woman couldn't safely learn how to avoid dying in childbirth. If you listen carefully, you'll hear the layered irony. A society that prized female purity created a black market of blood and whispers. A culture that claimed to value motherhood forced women to risk their lives to avoid becoming mothers again. And all the while, men in parliament and pulpits thundered about morality, blissfully insulated from the consequences their wives endured. Now, you may laugh at some of the methods. Vinegar sponges hardly sound reliable, and female pills sound like something from a dodgy Instagram ad. But the desperation was real. When your life expectancy shrinks with every pregnancy, even vinegar starts to look like salvation. And yet, as grim as this secret world was, it was only one half of the danger, because when contraception failed, and it often did, women turned to abortion. And abortion in Victorian England was not just illegal, it was deadly, both physically and socially. The room is dim, lit by a single oil lamp, curtains drawn, door bolted. You can hear the muffled sound of hooves on the cobblestones outside, but in here, the world shrinks to a single narrow bed and a basin of boiled water. The woman lying down is pale, gripping the edge of the mattress, sweat dampening her hair. Beside her, a midwife unwraps her tools. They gleam faintly in the lamplight. Crooked wires, long spoons, something that looks more like a shoemaker's awl than a medical instrument. The air smells of hot metal and chamomile tea, but beneath it lingers another scent: dread. This was the reality for countless Victorian women who sought abortions in secret. Officially, they were criminals. The 1861 Offences Against the Person Act made abortion illegal at any stage, punishable by life imprisonment. Doctors who performed them risked their licenses and reputations. Women who underwent them risked death or disgrace. But the law did not erase demand, it only drove it underground. Newspapers were filled with tragic stories. A young servant girl, dead from septicemia after taking powders. A housewife who never woke after visiting a doctor of women's complaints. Inquests would record causes of death in careful euphemisms. Peritonitis, fever, complications of the womb. Everyone knew what it meant, but no one said it aloud. And yet, the whispers kept circulating. Which midwife could be trusted? Which apothecary sold stronger brews? Which friendly doctor could be persuaded if the fee was high enough? In cities like London, Manchester, and Liverpool, whole neighborhoods carried reputations for such services. Some were little more than scams, greedy quacks preying on desperate women. Others were women themselves, often older midwives who had seen too many girls die in childbirth and resolved to help, even at the cost of their own safety. The horror was not just in the danger, but in the hypocrisy. Wealthy women often had quiet ways out, private physicians who would perform therapeutic procedures if their patient was deemed too frail to continue a pregnancy. Middle-class families might ship a daughter abroad for treatment. Poor women had none of these luxuries. Their choices were herbs, backstreet midwives, or death. Consider the irony: a society obsessed with morality created a system where morality killed. Abortion was condemned as unnatural, yet so was a woman who bore a child out of wedlock. Contraception was shunned, yet so was a family with too many mouths to feed. Women were trapped in a double bind, damned whichever path they took. And still they tried. Recipes circulated. Tansy tea, savin oil, doses of ergot. The dosages were uncertain, the side effects brutal. Too little, and nothing happened. Too much, and the woman convulsed. Her veins poisoned, her breathing shallow until it stopped altogether. In those moments, the line between survival and death was as thin as the wire in the midwife's hand. Sometimes, though the procedure worked, a woman might miscarry, survive, and carry on. She'd return to her life as though nothing had happened, carrying only the silent knowledge of how close she'd come. But the risk of infection lingered. No antibiotics existed. A small fever could spiral into raging sepsis within days. Families would whisper, "poor constitution," to explain the loss, as if weakness had killed her, not desperation. The cruelty of silence stretched even further. Women who had abortions often couldn't grieve openly, because to admit the truth was to invite ruin. They carried their sorrow alone, pressed into diaries, hidden between the lines of letters, or swallowed with bitter tea. Victorians were masters of euphemism, but euphemisms did not ease the weight of guilt or loss. Now, before you think all this was confined to dark alleys and tragic deaths, here's the twist: abortion wasn't some rare, scandalous occurrence. Historians estimate that in the 19th century, in certain cities, as many as 1 in 5 pregnancies ended deliberately. Think about that. Beneath the polished surface of Victorian respectability, the hidden world of secret procedures was pulsing constantly. A quiet rebellion against a system that offered women no safe choices. If you could listen closely, you'd hear the paradox beating like a drum. A society that worshipped motherhood forced women into deadly corners to escape it. Doctors, politicians, and priests thundered about purity, while their own households quietly navigated the same shadows. It's the kind of hypocrisy that makes you want to laugh, except the laughter catches in your throat because the cost was blood. And yet, the human side never disappears. Imagine being a woman in 1870, slipping a coin into the hand of a woman known only by reputation, praying you live to see the morning. Imagine the men, husbands, lovers, fathers, waiting anxiously outside, or sometimes never knowing at all. Imagine the mixture of terror and relief when the bleeding starts, when the cramps hit, when life itself seems to teeter on a knife's edge. Now, you might be thinking this is as grim as it gets. But no, this was only one battleground. Because while women fought their private wars against unwanted pregnancies in backrooms and kitchens, another battlefield loomed in the public eye, the very hospitals where they were meant to be saved. And in those hospitals, danger wasn't hidden. It walked openly, in white aprons and bloodied hands. If you thought the whispers of abortion were terrifying, wait until you step into a Victorian maternity ward, where doctors themselves became unwitting executioners. The doors creak open, and immediately the smell hits you, not the sweet scent of soap or antiseptic, because antiseptic hasn't arrived yet, but a heavy blend of iron and rot, blood, sweat, pus, and the faint sharpness of carbolic acid sprinkled half-heartedly in corners where it couldn't possibly do any good. Welcome to a Victorian maternity ward. The place is busy, too busy. Rows of women lie on narrow iron beds, their faces grey with exhaustion, their hair plastered with sweat. Some cradle newborns to their chests. Others stare at the ceiling, lips murmuring prayers, waiting for pains that don't stop, even after the child has come. The air is hot, humid, buzzing faintly with flies that seem impossible to chase out. The nurses move briskly, their white aprons stiff with starch, but stained with spots they have no time to wash out. And then, of course, there are the doctors. Men in black frock coats, confident, brisk, strolling from bed to bed with the air of generals inspecting troops. Their hands are busy, examining, prodding, stitching, delivering, but their hands are also dirty. Not metaphorically, but literally. They've just come from dissecting a corpse in the teaching hall. No one thought to wash. Soap was for servants, gentlemen had no need of such trifles. The idea that invisible organisms might cling to their skin was still laughed off as superstition. It was a deadly kind of confidence. Puerperal fever, childhood fever, stalked these wards like a silent predator. One touch, one examination, one careless hand moving from a cadaver to a mother, and the bacteria would pass invisibly, burrowing into the torn flesh of childbirth. Within days, the fever would rage, chills, convulsions, the belly swelling hard and hot. And then the funeral bell would toll, again and again. Women dreaded the hospitals. Midwives at home might have fewer tools, fewer formal skills, but they also carried fewer germs. It became an open joke in certain cities that if you wanted a woman dead, you sent her to a fine modern hospital. Statistics backed it up. Some maternity wards had death rates as high as 30%. Imagine it. Almost a third of women who went in never came out alive. Doctors, of course, had theories. They blamed miasma, bad air rising from sewers. They blamed the moral weakness of women. They even suggested it was the emotional state of the mother that invited illness. But the simplest explanation, that their own hands were the killers, was the one they refused to see. There was, however, one man who did see it. Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian physician, noticed something curious while working in Vienna. In one ward, staffed by midwives, the death rates were far lower than in the wards staffed by doctors. The difference. The doctors also dissected cadavers before delivering babies. Semmelweis suggested, shockingly, that doctors should wash their hands in chlorinated lime before touching patients. And when they did, the death rates plummeted. It should have been the medical breakthrough of the century. Instead, his colleagues ridiculed him. How dare anyone suggest that gentlemen's hands carried death? Semmelweis grew increasingly desperate, shouting, pleading, until eventually his career collapsed. He died in an asylum unrecognized. And yet, his insistence on hand-washing would later save countless lives, though not before decades of women paid the price for arrogance. Now, as you stand in this ward, try to imagine what it felt like. You've just survived labor, barely. You clutch your baby, praying for milk to come in. You notice the woman in the next bed groaning, her skin burning with fever. You whisper a prayer that it won't come to you. But the truth is, the fever was already there, carried by the hand that patted your shoulder. And here's the bitter twist of fate. The Victorian era prided itself on progress. Railways, telegraphs, great exhibitions of industry. Yet in the very same hospitals where science claimed its triumph, women died in droves from something as simple as dirty hands. It's the kind of irony that feels too sharp to laugh at. Though if you've ever eaten fast food handled by someone who clearly skipped the sink, you know the dread hasn't vanished entirely. The tragedy was not just medical but cultural. Women's voices, their suspicions, their lived experience that childbirth at home was safer than childbirth in hospitals, were dismissed as ignorance. Doctors knew best. Except, in this case, they didn't. And their certainty killed. If you think the hospitals were bad, just wait until you follow the trail of medical innovation that Victorians actually bragged about, where doctors experimented with chloroform, forceps, and even electric shocks on pregnant women, sometimes with disastrous results. Doctors loved their tools. The Victorians, after all, were in the age of invention. Steam trains, telegraphs, machines that could knit stockings faster than any pair of hands. Why shouldn't childbirth, too, be modernized? Forceps had already existed since the 17th century, but in the 19th century, they became the pride of many a Victorian obstetrician. Long, curved metal arms that slid around the baby's head like a pair of tongs. Yes, imagine reaching between a woman's legs with something resembling the utensils you'd use at a barbecue. With the right skill, forceps could save lives, pulling infants out of a stuck birth canal. With the wrong skill, and far too many doctors were more ambitious than careful, they could crush tiny skulls, tear mothers apart, or leave both scarred for life. Of course, the public rarely heard about the failures. Doctors presented forceps as proof of their superiority over midwives. After all, a midwife had only her hands and experience. A gentleman had gleaming instruments, which looked so much more scientific. Never mind that the mortality rates often rose the moment those shiny tools appeared. Then there was chloroform. In 1847, a James Young Simpson, a Scottish physician, discovered that a whiff of chloroform could knock a woman out cold during labor. The idea was revolutionary. Why not eliminate the pain of childbirth? When Queen Victoria herself demanded chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853, the practice spread like wildfire. If it was good enough for the Queen, surely it was good enough for everyone. And yet, it wasn't so simple. Doses were unpredictable. Too little, and the woman still felt everything. Too much, and her heart simply stopped. Anesthesia also slowed labor, leaving doctors to intervene more often with forceps. Women sometimes awoke to find their babies already dead, or themselves bleeding uncontrollably. Still, chloroform was hailed as progress, even as the graves quietly filled. The strangest, and perhaps most chilling, were the experiments. Some physicians, fascinated by electricity, applied small shocks to stimulate labor contractions. Others tested new chemical concoctions to tone the womb. Imagine lying on a narrow bed, weak from hours of labor, while a doctor enthusiastically straps wires to your belly like some sort of grim science fair project. If you think your last trip to the dentist was unnerving, picture this instead. An audience of medical students leaning in eagerly. Because yes, many births were public demonstrations in teaching hospitals. Privacy was a luxury, dignity even more so. And let's not forget the ever-present risk of hemorrhage. With no blood transfusions, no IV fluids, and only crude surgical techniques, a severe postpartum bleed was often a death sentence. Doctors tried everything from packing the womb with cloth to injecting iron solutions, which sometimes worked, and sometimes poisoned the patient. Survival was more luck than science. Now, if you're thinking the Victorians were monstrous, remember they were also desperate. They had seen too many women die. They wanted solutions. But progress was messy, often cruel, and always paid for with women's bodies. It's easy to sneer now, but when you're standing at the edge of a bed, staring at a mother who has been pushing for 2 days without success, even a brutal tool looks like salvation. Still, imagine the fear. A woman might enter a hospital hoping for relief and leave only in a coffin. Her family might whisper about God's will, but in truth, it was often man's arrogance. Behind the shiny brass handles of forceps and the sweet, sickly fumes of chloroform lay a battlefield where progress and death walked hand in hand. And this was only the medical side. Beyond the hospitals, another quieter menace lurked in every household, disguised as care: the tonics, powders, and miracle cures that promised to ease pregnancy, but often poisoned instead. If you thought chloroform and forceps sounded dangerous, just wait until you sip the Victorian pregnancy potions made of lead, mercury, and alcohol, because nothing says healthy motherhood like slowly poisoning yourself. The apothecary's window glitters like a treasure chest. Bottles of every color line the shelves, amber glass with cork stoppers, tall cylinders with gilded labels, squat jars with Latin names painted in looping script. Step close, and you'll see words like soothing syrup, femal restorative, nervous tonic, and strengthening elixir. To the wary Victorian mother, swollen and aching, these bottles whispered promises, ease, relief, and just enough strength to keep going. Inside, the smell is sharp and sweet all at once. A cocktail of herbs, alcohol, and something chemical that makes your nose prickle. The apothecary greets you with a nod, his black apron dusted with powders. He doesn't ask many questions. He doesn't need to. Women know what they're looking for, and he knows what to sell. Here's the secret: almost every one of those bottles is poison. Not poison in the villainous sense of arsenic slipped into tea, though arsenic appears, too, but poison disguised as medicine. Opium lurks in soothing syrups, given to pregnant women and even to their infants. Mercury and lead are ground into pills to purify the blood. Alcohol flows generously in almost every tonic, recommended to stimulate the appetite and calm the nerves. It does calm the nerves by dulling them. It also slowly eats away at the body, liver first. One of the most famous concoctions was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, proudly marketed as the savior of mothers everywhere. It contained morphine. Yes, morphine. For babies. Imagine spooning that into the mouth of a colicky infant while you yourself sipped laudanum to quiet the headaches of pregnancy. No wonder Victorian nurseries were eerily quiet. Pregnant women were urged to take female pills for everything from nausea to regulating the womb. These often contained strong purgatives like aloes or ergot, both of which could trigger miscarriage. Some women knew exactly what they were taking, others didn't. Labels were vague, doses imprecise. You swallowed what you were told, praying it would help, and sometimes it did, by killing the baby, or you. And then there were the restoratives, filled with iron filings, strychnine, or quinine. Some were mildly effective for anemia or fever. Others were cocktails of chemicals that sounded more like rat poison than remedies. Because here's the truth, modern pharmacology was still in its awkward teenage years. Victorians were experimenting, guessing, trying everything, and women's bodies were the laboratory. Now, don't picture all this as a back alley business. These tonics were sold openly, advertised in newspapers, endorsed by respectable doctors. Picture a respectable lady leafing through her morning paper, pausing at a charming ad. Dagana, Jane's sanative pills, for all female weaknesses. The illustration shows a serene mother with a cherubic baby. The small print doesn't mention the risk of organ failure. Imagine you're that woman, tired, swollen, your back screaming. You sip a spoonful of syrup and feel the warm wash of alcohol and opium smoothing everything out. For a moment, the weight of pregnancy lifts. You laugh, even. Maybe this is what relief feels like. You don't know that each sip nudges you closer to dependency, that your unborn child is swallowing it too, floating in a haze before ever taking its first breath. And the cruelest part, no one questioned it. Medicine was modern. Science was advancing. If it came in a glass bottle with a gold label, surely it must be safe. Only decades later would researchers look back in horror at how casually mothers and babies were drugged. If you've ever Googled your symptoms at 2 a.m. and decided WebMD is trying to kill you, you've had a taste of the Victorian dilemma, drowning in cures, none of them safe, and yet too desperate not to try. If you thought opium-laced baby syrups were horrifying, wait until you step into the kitchens of the poor, where home remedies brewed with herbs, gin, and desperation carried their own deadly risks. The apothecary's shelves were for those who could afford them. For everyone else, remedies bubbled in cracked kettles on iron stoves, brewed in chipped mugs, or ladled out of earthenware jars. Poverty didn't stop pain, it only made solutions more creative and more dangerous. Step into a one-room tenement in Whitechapel. The air is thick with coal, smoke, and boiled cabbage. A woman, belly heavy, leans over a pot where a bitter-smelling tea simmers. Pennyroyal leaves float on the surface, their sharp, minty scent cutting through the staleness of the room. She sips, grimacing at the taste, praying it will calm her cramps, or bring them on harder, depending on what she hopes for. Pennyroyal was a common herb, cheap and easy to find. Everyone knew it could regulate a woman's cycle. Everyone also knew it could destroy her liver and kill her outright. Another woman crushes ergot fungus, the black, shriveled growth that infects rye. It had been used for centuries to speed labor, contracting the womb so fiercely it could expel a baby, or tear the uterus apart. In the right dose, it was a miracle. In the wrong one, it was a death sentence. But precision was impossible in a kitchen with a pestle and mortar. So she guessed, and hoped. Gin was another favorite. Cheap, plentiful numbing. Pregnant women swigged it to calm nerves, dull pain, or strengthen the constitution. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it left them vomiting, dehydrated, and weaker than before. In Victorian slums, gin was medicine, comfort, and poison all in one. Home remedies spread mouth to mouth, whispered across laundry lines or shared in factory yards. My aunt swore by Tansy, boil black cohosh and drink it at night. Rub castor oil on your belly, it'll help the baby turn. Most of these cures came from folk traditions centuries old, passed down from midwives who had little else to offer. Some genuinely soothed. Many didn't. A few were lethal. It wasn't just the poor, though. Middle-class women, too, mixed their own concoctions. Recipe books often had a discreet section on female complaints, written in careful code. A respectable lady might not dare visit a backstreet abortionist, but she might steep herbs in her own parlor under the guise of tonic tea. But here's the tragic comedy of it all. The line between remedy and poison was razor thin. A teaspoon calmed nausea, a tablespoon stopped the heart. Without standardized doses or scientific testing, every sip was a gamble. Imagine making tea from something that might soothe your womb, or shrivel your kidneys. That was everyday reality. And if the remedies failed, well, you gritted your teeth and bore it, because there was no other choice. A woman might joke about her monthly brew, but behind the laugh was the knowledge that she was balancing on a knife edge, one mistake away from leaving her children motherless. If this sounds terrifying, it was. But it was also ordinary. Just as we today accept side effects listed on pill bottles, Victorians accepted that medicine was dangerous. The difference was, no one told them what those dangers were. The knowledge wasn't hidden. It simply didn't exist yet. Picture yourself in that tenement kitchen, sipping a bitter cup of pennyroyal, clutching your belly as cramps start to twist. Is it working? Is it killing you? You don't know. And there's no one to ask. And so the cycle continued, bottles in apothecaries, brews in kitchens, prayers whispered into steaming mugs. Every remedy a risk, every cure a coin toss. And all of it swallowed down because the alternative, suffering through pregnancy without relief, was unthinkable. If you think dangerous teas and tonics were bad, wait until you step into the Victorian streets themselves, where filth, overcrowding, and raw sewage created a citywide hazard for pregnant women and their babies. The air hits you before anything else. Thick, damp, sour. Imagine walking through London in the mid-1800s, your boots squelching on cobblestones slick with rain, mud, and things you don't want to identify. The Thames rolls sluggish and black beside you, carrying human waste, animal carcasses, and the occasional unidentifiable lump downstream. Pregnant or not, just breathing here feels like a hazard. For a woman already weakened by childbearing, every inhalation was a gamble. In the tenements, the walls weep with moisture, plaster crumbling in sickly flakes. Rats scurry over your shoes, bold as anything. The water pump down the lane offers a cloudy trickle that smells faintly of metal and worse things. And yet this is what women drank, boiled for tea, ladled into soup, poured into the mouths of babies, who were often gone before their first birthday. A pregnant woman climbs 3 rickety flights of stairs to her rented room, each step jarring her swollen ankles. The room smells of mildew, damp wool, and the neighbors frying herring seeping through thin walls. She lies down, but rest doesn't come. The coughing of a child in the corner rattles through the night. Tuberculosis. Consumption, they called it, and it stalked these slums like a patient predator. For expectant mothers, whose bodies were already taxed to the limit, one infection could tip the scale from survival to death. Even outside the slums, disease was everywhere. Cholera swept through crowded districts in waves, striking hardest at the poor who couldn't flee. Typhus lurked in lice, scarlet fever in the breath of children, diphtheria in every crowded schoolroom. Pregnancy didn't grant immunity. It made women more vulnerable. Their immune systems faltered, their bodies strained, and illness often claimed both mother and child. Sanitation reform was only just beginning. Drains were open ditches, privies overflowed into yards, and the miasma theory, the belief that bad air caused disease, kept people worrying about smells while ignoring germs. It would be decades before Pasteur and Koch convinced the world that invisible organisms were the real killers. Until then, the fight against filth was half-blind. And here's a cruel irony: Victorian society loved to preach about morality and purity. But when it came to actual cleanliness, the standards were abysmal. A lady might faint at the idea of showing her ankles, yet she walked daily through streets lined with horse dung, human waste, and rotting vegetables. Respectability was spotless, the city was not. Pregnant women bore the brunt of it. Malnutrition left them weak, anemia drained their energy, and constant exposure to disease eroded what strength remained. Babies were often born small, frail, already fighting against a hostile world. Many didn't make it. Neither did their mothers. Yet, people coped. They had to. They joked about the great stinks. They scrubbed their floors with carbolic soap. They opened windows to let in fresh air that was only slightly less foul than what lingered inside. Survival was a balancing act, and humor softened the edges. After all, what else could you do when your city smelled like a backed-up sewer? Picture yourself there, stomach queasy, nostrils stinging, boots slipping as you dodge piles of refuse. A neighbor calls out, laughing as she swings a bucket of water straight into the gutter, narrowly missing your skirts. You laugh back because this is normal. This is home. This is what everyone puts up with. And still, in the back of your mind, the thought nags: if the air itself feels poisonous, what chance does your unborn child have? If you think the streets were hostile, wait until you see what happened inside the hospitals, where childbirth was transformed from a natural event into a battlefield of infection, steel, and ignorance. The first thing you notice is the smell. Not the sweet lavender and vinegar that your neighbor swears will cleanse a sick room, but the sharp, metallic tang of blood, sweat, and something rotting beneath it all. A Victorian hospital was not a place of healing, it was a place of last resort. If you ended up here while pregnant, it usually meant things had gone very, very wrong. Picture a long ward lined with beds, each crammed too close to the next, separated only by thin curtains that did little to hide the groans of the women inside. Nurses moved between them in starched aprons, carrying basins that slosh with cloudy water. There's no smell of disinfectant, because disinfectant isn't a thing yet. Not properly. Instruments are wiped on an apron or dunked in tepid water before they're used again. And that gleaming pair of forceps. They've just been pulled out of a delivery across the hall. No sterilization, no gloves, no understanding of what's clinging invisibly to the metal. You, the time traveler, stand awkwardly at the foot of a bed as a woman labors under the gaze of a medical student. He's young, eager, and absolutely convinced that watching her writhe is part of his education. In fact, there's a small crowd of students, arms folded, pens scratching on paper, while the woman gasps and thrashes, her dignity stripped away along with her bloodied sheets. Doctors at the time were so proud of their scientific interventions that they often barged in where midwives had once been trusted. Forceps, chloroform, surgical cuts, these were the tools of progress. But progress without hygiene was a death sentence. Enter puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever. A silent killer spread not by curses, not by bad air, but by the very hands of the men who thought themselves saviors. Imagine, a doctor performs an autopsy in the morning, dissecting a corpse with bare hands. In the afternoon, he hurries to deliver a baby. Same hands, same clothes. No thought given to the invisible filth he carries with him. The woman survives the birth, maybe even smiles with relief, but within days her body is racked with fever, her abdomen swollen with infection. By the time the truth dawns, it's too late. She dies screaming, and her baby, if it survives, becomes motherless. This wasn't rare. Entire wards saw wave after wave of mothers die within days of delivery. Mortality rates in some hospitals reached 30%. It was a horror so common that women whispered of hospitals as places you entered only to die. And still, society told them to be grateful for medical care, to trust in science, to believe that pain and loss were part of their lot. There were voices in the wilderness, of course. Ignaz Semmelweis in Vienna, who dared to suggest that maybe, just maybe, doctors should wash their hands, was laughed out of the profession. Florence Nightingale fought for sanitation, Joseph Lister for antiseptics, but change came slowly, grudgingly. Until then, progress marched on in blood-stained boots. And yet, despite the danger, there was something seductive about hospitals. For wealthy women, chloroform promised a painless delivery. Queen Victoria herself famously demanded it. For the poor, hospitals offered the only chance of help when things went wrong. The problem was that stepping through those doors meant rolling the dice with death itself. You feel the tension in the air as another woman screams down the ward. Students cluster closer, the doctor barks orders, forceps glint in the gaslight. The scene feels both clinical and grotesque, like a theatre where the drama is life and death. And all you can think, standing there with modern hindsight, is how many of these women would have lived if someone had just told the men to wash their hands. It's almost funny in the darkest way possible. Victorians were terrified of hummerdust ankles, yet they had no problem with doctors wiping bloody hands on their coats before reaching into a woman's womb. Standards were strict where they didn't matter, and non-existent where they did. If you thought hospitals were bad, just wait until you step back outside, into the world of Victorian medicines, miracle cures, where bottles of poison were sold as hope, and desperate mothers swallowed death by the teaspoon. The shop door creaks as you push it open, and immediately your nose is assaulted by a swirl of scents. Sweet licorice, sharp camphor, the bitter undertone of something chemical and vaguely sinister. Welcome to the Victorian apothecary, the most dangerous candy shop you'll ever step into. Glass jars gleam on the shelves, their labels handwritten in curling script: chlorodyne, Godfrey's cordial, soothing syrup, elixir of opium. Each one promises relief, comfort, even salvation. Each one could just as easily kill you. For the expectant mother, this place was both sanctuary and trap. Morning sickness. Take a dose of laudanum. Trouble sleeping. A spoonful of opium syrup will calm you right down. Anxiety about the baby. A little chloroform on a handkerchief to quiet the nerves. And here's the kicker. These weren't fringe remedies whispered in alleys. These were mainstream, respectable, recommended by doctors and advertised in newspapers alongside baking powder and corsets. You pick up a bottle of Godfrey's cordial. The label reads like a lullaby, safe, soothing, for infants and mothers alike. It's a potent blend of morphine and treacle. Yes, treacle, the sticky sweet syrup of comfort, laced with enough narcotic to knock out both mother and child. Babies fed on it stopped crying, yes, but sometimes they stopped breathing too. Imagine rocking your infant, proud of the silence at last, only to realize hours later that silence has become permanent. And still the cordial sold by the gallon. Women drank laudanum like water. It dulled the relentless aches of pregnancy, quieted the sharp edge of contractions, and smoothed the anxieties of life in a world that demanded constant obedience. Laudanum wasn't taboo, it was fashionable. Writers swore by it, artists courted its haze, respectable housewives measured out drops like sugar for tea. But dependence crept in, tolerance grew, and for pregnant women, the line between comfort and collapse blurred dangerously fast. Even the Queen herself dabbled. Victoria's famous use of chloroform during childbirth sparked a sensation. If Her Majesty could demand sweet oblivion, then surely every woman had the right. Newspapers debated whether it was a miracle or an affront to God. But the practice spread. What they didn't discuss was how easily overdoses occurred, how little anyone understood of dosage or long-term effects, or how painless sometimes meant lifeless when things went wrong. And if the drugs didn't get you, the quack remedies might. Herbal teas that claimed to regulate the womb often hid toxic ingredients. Arsenic wafers were sold to make women pale and delicate. But arsenic doesn't stop politely at complexion. It seeps into the blood. Mercury was prescribed for female complaints, which is a genteel way of saying, we have no idea what's wrong with you. So try this poison instead. It's tempting to laugh standing there in the apothecary aisle at the sheer absurdity of it all. Bottles of poison lined up like sweets, mothers cheerfully dosing themselves, while the shopkeeper nods approvingly. But it's not hard to see why they did it. Pain was constant, medicine was mysterious, and desperation makes gamblers of us all. If a syrup promised relief, who wouldn't take it? Especially when every other part of life already felt like a roll of the dice. And here's where the cruelest irony settles in. Victorian society judged women harshly for weakness, yet sold them remedies that ensured dependence. They were expected to endure childbirth stoically, to suffer in silence, yet were handed bottles of liquid oblivion to get through the day. Addiction was not understood, only whispered about. A nervous wife was pitied, an addicted one was shamed. And in either case, the cycle of pregnancy, pain, and poison rolled on. You glance one last time around the apothecary. The glass glints invitingly, labels promising safety, bottles humming with false hope. A mother's hand reaches past yours to buy another vial of chlorodyne, her face lined with fatigue. She doesn't meet your eye, because in her heart she knows the truth. This cure might save her, or it might be her undoing. But really, what choice does she have? If you thought the apothecary shelves were deadly, wait until you step into the back rooms where whispers spread of remedies for ending pregnancies altogether. Methods so desperate, so brutal, they make laudanum look merciful. The streets are quieter here, the lamps throwing longer shadows as you duck into an alley behind a row of shops. There's no bright apothecary window now, no respectable glass bottles lined in neat rows. Instead, you find yourself standing at a plain wooden door, the kind that creaks ominously when opened, leading into a dimly lit room heavy with the scent of herbs, alcohol, and something acrid beneath it all. This is where women came when they couldn't, or wouldn't, carry a pregnancy to term. Sometimes they were young and unmarried, terrified of scandal. Sometimes they were mothers already worn thin by too many births, desperate not to add another child to a table already bare. Sometimes they were simply too weak to survive another delivery. The reasons were endless. The options were not. Abortion was illegal, of course. The Offences Against the Person Act of 1861 made it a crime punishable by imprisonment. But illegality did not erase need. Instead, it forced women into secrecy, into the arms of backstreet practitioners, who promised solutions with whispered guarantees and a bottle of something that smelled more like turpentine than medicine. Herbal concoctions were common: pennyroyal tea, tansy oil, a got of rye. Each claimed to bring on menstruation in polite code. In truth, these were poisons. Their margins of safety razor thin. A few drops might cause cramping, a few drops more might stop a woman's heart. Yet recipes circulated in hushed tones, scribbled in notebooks, passed between servants and laundresses, whispered over washboards and market stalls. Desperation made every risk worth taking. Others turned to mechanical means. Sharp instruments, knitting needles, even goose quills were pressed into service, wielded in the shadows by untrained hands. Infection was almost inevitable. Hemorrhage even more so. Women bled out on dirty floors, their cries muffled by pillows so the neighbors wouldn't hear. Families buried the bodies quietly, murmuring about fevers and weak constitutions, while the truth rotted in silence. Even doctors weren't immune to the trade. Some performed abortions discreetly for wealthy clients, disguising them as medical necessities. They charged exorbitant fees, and their reputations kept them shielded. But for the poor, there was no shield, only risk, shame, and the constant fear of discovery. And then there were the miracle pills. Advertisements in newspapers danced coyly around the subject. Lady's friend, restorer of monthly cycles, regulator of the female system. Everyone knew what they meant. The pills promised relief, but the contents were often worse than the condition itself. Powders laced with mercury, arsenic, or other toxins that punished the body more cruelly than any pregnancy could. You imagine a woman sitting in a tiny, airless room, clutching her stomach as cramps twist her body, wondering if the blood that follows will bring relief or death. She is alone. There is no doctor by her side, no sympathetic midwife. Only a bottle on the table half empty, and a prayer whispered to a God who may or may not be listening. Society, of course, judged her harshly. A mother who died in childbirth was a tragic angel. A woman who sought to end her pregnancy was a sinner, a criminal, a cautionary tale. The hypocrisy stings even across the centuries. Women, punished for survival, damned for trying to control their own bodies in a world that gave them no control at all. And yet, behind all the fear and danger, there is something undeniably human here, an echo of resistance, a refusal to simply accept what fate and society demanded. These women risked everything, sometimes succeeding, often failing, but always driven by the same relentless truth, the desire to make choices in a world that allowed them none. It is dark in this back room. The air is heavy. Somewhere outside, a carriage rattles by, its wheels clattering on cobblestones, a reminder that life goes on oblivious to the struggles hidden here. You step back into the street, the gaslight stinging your eyes, the whispers of desperate women still echoing in your ears. And so we leave the gaslit streets, the crowded wards, the echoing nurseries, and the secret back rooms behind us. The world of Victorian pregnancy was not gilded romance, nor the delicate poetry so often painted in novels and portraits. It was blood and risk, duty and silence, laughter pressed tight against despair. It was a time when motherhood was called sacred, but the women themselves were treated as expendable. They endured laudanum, laced nights and chloroform, dimmed labors. They prayed against the fever that came days after birth, prayed against the water they drank, the air they breathed, the very hands that touched them in so-called care. They whispered over herbs, risked shadows, swallowed poisons, and buried more children than any mother today could imagine surviving. And yet, somehow, they did survive. Some of them, at least. Enough to carry their families, enough to hold fragile new lives against their chests and sing lullabies into rooms that smelled of coal, smoke, and milk. Enough to leave behind descendants who now walk modern streets, horrified at what their foremothers endured, but here nonetheless because they endured it. It is easy to judge the past, to shake our heads at the ignorance, the cruelty, the hypocrisy. But perhaps the sharper truth is that survival has always been messy. That desperation has always pushed people toward choices that look unthinkable from the outside. And perhaps the deepest lesson the Victorians leave us is not their superstition or their folly, but their relentless will to endure in the face of it all. So close the door softly now. Let the gaslight fade. The sounds of those narrow streets and crowded wards will linger, yes, but only as echoes. What remains most clearly is the image of women who laughed where they could, wept where they must, and bore far more than they should have been asked to. And as the city grows quiet around us, one thought settles like dust in the air. If survival was victory in the Victorian age, then every mother who lived long enough to tell her story was a conqueror. The rest, the ones who did not, deserve not just our sorrow, but our remembrance.